Hello and welcome to Drama Recaps. Today we will delve into the 2009 American comedy drama film named Paperman. Spoilers ahead. A couple, Richard Dunn, a novelist, and his wife Claire, a vascular surgeon, are driving to a beautiful house in the countryside. As Claire steps out of the car, a blonde man in a superhero costume, named Captain Excellent, appears in the driver's seat. He talks with Richard about the dangers of the area, and Richard is later startled by a dead raccoon, which leads to an "I told you so" look from Captain Excellent. Once inside the house, Richard spots a garish and colorful couch, and he instantly believes it means trouble. That night, Claire gifts Richard a laptop, but he doesn't seem happy about it. He feels pressure from his wife, but assures her he will be fine. When she goes to work, Richard tries to write but keeps failing. Captain Excellent advises caution as Richard heads out to town on his bicycle. In town, Richard encounters a young woman named Abby setting fire to a trash bin. He extinguishes the flames, ruining his jacket, and then follows her. Abby notices him, fixes his squeaky wheels, and asks why he's following her. Richard says he's looking for a babysitter, and Abby agrees to the job. Later, Richard struggles to write, feeling distracted by the ugly couch. He then goes to the pier and humorously argues with Captain Excellent. Richard comes back home but still can't write. Abby arrives for the supposed babysitting job, and Richard tells her about himself and Claire. When Abby inquires about the baby, Richard admits there's no child for her to look after. Thinking she's there to watch the house, Abby makes herself comfortable, plays around, and reads a bit from Richard's first book, The Renderer, which she sort of likes. A young man named Christopher, who likes Abby, visits her at Richard's house and confesses his love for her. Meanwhile, Captain Excellent chides Richard for hiring Abby as a babysitter. Richard requests a motivational speech from him. Coming back home, Richard discovers Abby has made soup for him, which he enjoys. They talk about homemade soups and Abby's uncaring boyfriend, Bryce, who she calls chicken poop. Richard shares his idea for a book with an extinct chicken breed as the main character, and they start to become friends. Richard asks Abby to return the following week. The next day, Richard questions Claire about their happiness, and she reassures him they're fine. He's a bit distressed when Claire cuts his lobster open. Abby continues reading The Renderer and spends time with Christopher. Later, she sleeps with Bryce, who shows that he doesn't care about her. Richard spends the weekend with Claire before she leaves him alone for an entire week. He tries to write but becomes fixated on the ugly couch, eventually taking it outside. Instead of writing, he occupies himself with other activities, like making origami animals. His efforts are once again disrupted when Abby returns for more supposed babysitting. Abby gives Richard a fish her father caught and tells him she read his book. Richard asks for her opinion, and he confesses he doesn't like the book. He shows her vegetables for her next soup creation, and as he leaves, Abby tells him she loved his book. Richard goes for a drink and gets a bit tipsy while talking about his new book. Back home, he thanks Abby for the soup and talks about being the last of his family line and his wife's job. Abby misinterprets his intentions and hits him with a book before leaving. The next morning, Abby regrets hitting Richard, and Richard finds Claire at home. Claire asks about the couch and soup, and Captain Excellent advises Richard to stay calm. Claire notices extra copies of Richard's first book and goes to shower. Abby then arrives, and Richard tells her to leave. Abby accuses him of coming on to her the night before, and Richard is shocked. Claire spots Abby, and Richard lies, saying she's a Girl Scout. He then fails to start his second novel and botches cooking the fish Abby gave him. After Claire leaves, Richard apologizes to Abby, and they set a new meeting. Abby returns, and Captain Excellent warns Richard not to do anything unwise. Richard and Abby walk on the beach, and she suddenly quotes from Richard's book and jumps into the cold sea. Richard gets scared, and when Abby comes out, he shouts at her. Back at his house, Abby reveals that she once dared her twin sister to dive into the cold sea, resulting in her death. She has carried this guilt all her life. Christopher feels hurt that Abby shared this secret with Richard. Richard constructs a couch from copies of Renderer and talks about potential titles for his new book. Abby suggests Paper Man, and Richard writes it down. They dine at a diner when Bryce appears, stating that they don't have a place for the party. Richard offers his place for Bryce's party, and Bryce agrees. When Claire comes home, she's angry at Richard for putting the furniture outside and for not calling her all week. He questions Claire about their hidden happiness, and she walks away, telling him to grow up. Richard fights with Captain Excellent over starting his new book, but he still can't. That night, Abby teaches Richard how to properly cut a fish, and they cook dinner and exchange homemade gifts. Abby sees Christopher watching them but ignores him. Richard gets ready for the party, and Bryce and his friends show up, followed by more and more teenagers. Richard becomes the life of the party but takes it too far to hide his loneliness, ending up feeling empty. Abby rejects Bryce, who hooks up with another girl. Richard tells Bryce about Abby, and after some insults, Bryce punches Richard. Abby yells at Bryce to leave and ends the party abruptly. Abby stays with Richard that night, and he tells her he loves her in a fatherly way. Abby recalls her sister's death and begins to cry. As Richard and Abby sleep, Christopher and Captain Excellent appear, revealing that they are imaginary friends to Abby and Richard, respectively. They discuss the good and bad of being imaginary friends, and Captain Excellent advises Christopher to leave if he gets the chance. They shake hands and disappear. The next morning, Claire arrives with Lucy and Peter. She hits Richard, demanding an explanation for the mess in Abby's presence. Richard explains that Abby is the babysitter, and Claire sends her away. Claire believes Richard has been unfaithful, but Richard insists that Abby is only a friend. The couple argues, and Richard reveals that he wanted to have a warm relationship and be himself, as well as have a baby with Claire. She responds by calling him the baby. Lucy and Peter, feeling uncomfortable, leave the room, and Claire screams at Richard, calling him a loser. Richard yells back, expressing his confusion, and Claire leaves. Richard then rides his bike to a remote coastal location, where he tells Captain Excellent that he's free and doesn't need an imaginary friend anymore. Asking for one last piece of advice, Captain Excellent speaks and then flies away, leaving Richard alone. Abby talks to Claire, telling her she wishes Richard were her father. Claire says nothing and drives off. Eventually, Richard finds the name for his book's main character, Richard, and goes to tell Abby that he's leaving. He gives her an origami swan, and she kisses him gently. Richard nods, wipes a tear from her cheek, and leaves. Abby feels content for the first time in years, noticing that her imaginary friend, Christopher, has ended his existence, and she knows it's time for her to move on. Richard slowly reconciles with his wife and begins a fresh start, both in his relationship and in writing his new book. He gives hope to Abby and finds a new beginning for himself. Richard and Claire get in the car together, and he tells her it's okay. In a post-credits scene, Captain Excellent waves at Richard and then raises his middle finger.